Hi, it's Mr. Bennett, and in this video what we need to talk about is we need to talk about community interactions. Now, if you remember back to our first unit, a community of organisms is when you look at an ecosystem and you look at all the living things in that area. That's the community, all the living things that interact with each other in a given area. And so community interactions is we're talking about how all the living things interact with each other. You can see here with this African porcupine and these lions, there's some interactions going on here. It could lead to the porcupine being eaten, or it could lead to the lions having a very, very sore nose. Now, before we can talk about community interactions, one concept we got to hammer out is we got to hammer out the concept of the niche, Now, every living thing on the planet fits into the planet somewhere, somehow, some way, in some food chain, some food web, whatsoever. A niche is kind of talking about that. A niche is talking about where a system fits in its ecosystem. You can think of a niche as kind of like the job of the organism. What does the organism do to get the food and water it needs to survive? And organisms have different ways of getting the food and water they need to survive. Here we've got 5 different species of water birds, from flamingos to ducks to avocets, oyster catchers, and plovers. All of these guys need food, but all 5 of them get food in a very different way. Flamingos have these long necks and they're able to get food that's deep down in the water. Diving ducks are able to go upside down in the water and get stuff that's in grasses and so forth. Avocets have these special curved bills that allow them to filter food out of the water. Oyster catchers are going to go out and they're going to eat the oysters. And then you got the plovers that are running around catching insects on the beach. So all 5 of these guys fit into a different niche because all 5 of them have a different way of getting the food that they need. Kind of like I said, a niche is kind of like a job. If you can think about it, a job is a way that you get money, and there's all sorts of different ways that people can legally get money. Each of those ways that you can legally get money we call a niche. I have one niche as a teacher, someone's a doctor, has another niche as a doctor. We both get the money we need to survive, but we do it in very different ways. That's what you got going on here with the niche, is organisms get what they need in order to survive, but they do it in a way that's different from other species. So once we understand that organisms have their own little place they fit into their community, into their ecosystem, now we can start talking about how those different species interact with each other. Now, generally speaking, there are 3 ways that different species can interact with each other. 2 species can interact with each other in any of these 3 ways. And the 3 ways that they can interact with each other is you've got predation. One species kills and eats another one. That's a community interaction. These 2 species here are interacting. This one's going to die. This one's going to get something to eat. That's predation. Other form of species interactions or community interactions is competition. Here we have a dead hippo. Here we have a crocodile, and we have a lion who both want to eat the dead hippo, and they're fighting over it. That's competition. So when 2 species are fighting over the same resources, same type of food, same living space, same water, whatever, that's an example of competition. And then finally, the third type of species interactions is going to be symbiosis, is when 2 species live close to each other and they coexist together. Now we're going to go through and we're going to talk about each of these in more detail, but these are the 3 ways that organisms can interact with each other. So let's talk about the most simple of these interactions, the one you're going to be the most familiar with. That's going to be predation. Predation is pretty simple. One species kills and eats another. So a ladybug eating an aphid, an osprey eating a fish, a group of lions eating a Cape buffalo, or a tarantula eating a snake. These are all examples of predation. Pretty simple. Now, the one type of predation that you don't want to miss out on is not all predators are carnivores. That technically, if you're talking about an herbivore, this is an example of predation. The cows are predating on the grass. The grass is alive and it's dying as it's being eaten by another living thing. So not all, when we're talking about species interactions, not all predation interactions involve a carnivore eating an herbivore. An herbivore eating a plant would count as predation every bit as much as these lions eating this Cape buffalo would. So, number 1 way that they can interact with each other is through predation. So one type of community interaction is one species can kill and eat the other one. Other type of community interaction can be competition. This is where 2 species compete with each other for the same resources. Here we've got elk, here we've got deer. You can find elk and deer living in the same mountains here in Utah. Now, what are they competing for? Same food. Both of these guys can eat grass. Every bite of grass that a deer eats is a bite of grass that an elk cannot eat. And so elk and deer compete with each other for food. And so there's all sorts of different types of competition out there where two different species are competing for the exact same resource. Most common way that you see competition happen is over water. Everything needs water, and every drink of water that one species takes is a drink of water that another species doesn't have available to it. So competition. Now, here's the thing about competition. Whenever there's a competition, there's going to be a loser. You're going to have a winner and you're going to have a loser. And this brings us to the idea of the competitive exclusion principle. Basically what this is saying is if two species compete, one's going to win, one's going to lose. The one that wins continues on as the winner. The other one, the species that lost, is either going to go extinct, bye-bye, or it's going to have to move to a new niche. So technically speaking, if two species are in the same niche, and remember a niche is how a species gets the food and water it needs to survive. So if you have two species that are both going after the exact same type of food and the exact same source of water, they're going to compete with each other. And ultimately there can only be one winner. So one of the species will live, the other one will be forced out. Here's a way of thinking about competitive exclusion principle. There's only room for one quarterback on a team, period. You can't have two quarterbacks at the same time. So if you have a quarterback and someone else wants to be the starting quarterback, the two guys are going to compete with each other. One's going to lose, one's going to win and be the starter, the other one's going to lose and be the bench warmer. That's competitive exclusion at work. Is anytime you have competition over the same thing, but in a biology class, obviously, we're talking about living things. Now, let me give you some examples of competitive exclusion. This is the California condor. This is a turkey vulture. Now, the California condor is an extraordinarily endangered bird. There's only about 40 of them left in the world. And one of the reasons why there's so few of them left is the California condor has been competing with the turkey vulture for the last several hundred years. These two birds, both of them are carrion eaters. They're detrivores. They eat dead stuff. They go and they find a dead carcass and they eat it. And so anytime, let's say, a deer dies, these two birds are going to be competing with each other to eat that dead deer. Well, if the turkey vulture eats the deer, that's less food that's available for the California condor. And what we've seen is California condor numbers have gone down. Granted, humans played a role in that too. They've gone down where turkey vulture numbers have gone up because these guys, the turkey vultures, are out competing the California condors. And the reason why the turkey vultures are winning, they reproduce faster. California condor has like one baby every 2 to 3 years. Turkey vultures have 2 babies every year. Another example of competitive exclusion. Let's talk about coyotes and wolves. Back in the 1930s, humans wiped out every wolf that lived in Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana. They were gone. We killed them all off. When the wolves disappeared, that made it so there was more food for coyotes. And so coyote populations actually went up after we got rid of the wolves. Well, 20 years ago, in 1995, we brought the wolves back. We put them in Yellowstone, and they've been spreading all over the western United States since then. What has happened to the coyote population? It's gone down because they can't compete with the wolves for food. They want to eat the same things as the wolves, but they can't compete with them. And so because of competitive exclusion, the coyotes can't be in the same niche as the wolves. Coyotes used to eat bigger stuff. Now they're stuck eating things like mice and so forth, because the wolves have taken the niche as the top predator in an area. So that's a competitive exclusion principle. You can't have two species in the same niche at the same time. If you do, there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser every time. Now, one thing about competitive exclusion is two different species can have an overlapping niche, but not the same niche. They can have two niches that are very, very similar to each other, but they can't be exactly the same. Let me give you an example. This is a kestrel. This is North America's smallest falcon. You've seen these guys. They're all over Cache Valley. They're the little birds that you see hovering in the air over the fields. That's a kestrel. This is a red-tailed hawk. You've seen these too. This is North America's most common hawk. Now these guys both like to eat mice. They're both really good at catching mice and they both like to eat them. And so kestrels and red-tailed hawks compete over mice because every mouse that a kestrel eats is a mouse that a red-tailed hawk can't eat. So according to competitive exclusion, because they're going after the same type of food, there should be a competition and there should be a winner and a loser. But kestrels and red-tailed hawks, they both eat mice, but they also eat some different things too. Kestrels are small enough, they're only about the size of like a robin or a starling, that if they can't find enough mice, they're more than happy to eat grasshoppers. Red-tailed hawks are big enough they can catch things like rabbits. Now, a red-tailed hawk would have a hard time catching a grasshopper, and a kestrel is way too small to kill and eat a rabbit. And so what happens is if one of these two species starts eating more than its share of the mice, the other species can go to its secondary food source. So if the kestrels start eating all the mice, and there's not very many mice left for the red-tailed hawks, rather than starve to death, they just start eating more rabbits. And so these guys have overlapping niches, but it's not exactly the same. The kestrel eats something that the red-tailed hawk doesn't, and the red-tailed hawk eats something that the kestrel doesn't. And that's what allows these two species to exist at the same time, even though they both eat the same thing. So we've talked about 2 out of the 3 types of community interactions, 2 of the 3 ways that living things can interact with each other. There could be predation, one kills and eats the other one, and then there can be competition. They fight over something. The third one is symbiosis. And symbiosis is when 2 species live direct contact with each other, but they don't kill each other, and they don't compete with each other. You all seen Finding Nemo, I assume, and in Finding Nemo they talk about a symbiotic relationship that the clownfish has with the sea anemone. Sea anemones are related to jellyfish, and they have these stinging cells. Well, the clownfish live inside the sea anemone, and this is an example of symbiosis because they live with each other and they don't hurt each other. And so that's an example of a symbiotic relationship. And there are 3 main types of symbiotic relationship that we're going to talk about. You got mutualism, you got commensalism, and you've got parasitism. And we'll go through and we'll talk about these 3 in depth. So the first type of symbiosis we'll talk about is probably the one you're most familiar with, mutualism. Mutualism is when you have 2 species and they benefit by using each other. So here we got a monkey that's getting the hookup by cleaning this cow. The cow is losing parasites out of its ears, and the monkey is getting a meal. The monkey will pick out ticks and fleas and so forth out of the cow's ear and eat them. So the monkey benefits by getting a meal, the cow gets a benefit by being clean. Here you have a crocodile, and you have this little species of bird here. The crocodile will not eat the bird. He'll keep his mouth open and wait for the bird to come in and pick clean his teeth. So here we have some symbiosis going on. The crocodile gets his teeth clean. The bird gets a meal. We got the classic example of the bee and the flower. The bee goes to the flower, it gets a free meal, gets nectar. The flower then puts its pollen on the bee, which then gets spread to the next flower and helps the flowers reproduce. Here's another example. Here's ants. These guys live on the acacia tree, and what they do is the tree feeds the ant a sugary nectar, and then what the ants do is if anything gets close to this tree, it attacks it. You see how there's no plants growing around this tree? That's because the ants killed it. And then if something like a cow comes in and tries to eat this tree, the ants are going to attack it. So this is mutualism. Now, one thing about this is that in mutualism, both species are benefiting by using each other. Let me give you an example. If a species can figure out a way to cheat, it'll do it. There's a species of bee that will actually come in and bite the bottom of a flower, suck the nectar out of the bottom of the flower, and never touch the pollen of the flower. So the species, they're not doing this just out of the goodness of their heart to help each other out. They want the hookup. And if one species stops giving the hookup, they'll move on to something else. And so that's mutualism. That is where both species benefit from each other. The next type of symbiosis is commensalism. And commensalism is where one species gets helped and the other one is neither helped nor hurt. So in mutualism, both species get benefit by interacting with each other. In commensalism, one species gets the hookup and the other one is not affected whatsoever. It's a pretty rare thing to find, and you don't find very many examples of commensalism. But an example of commensalism is this bird here called the cattle egret. These guys always like to hang out around Cape Buffalo. Now what happens is the Cape Buffalo poop, and the poop of the Cape Buffalo attract bugs that the cattle egret then eats. And so the cattle egret gets a meal because it's hanging out around the Cape Buffalo, but it doesn't really do anything for the Cape buffalo. It doesn't help them spot predators or give them more food or anything like that. And so this would be an example of commensalism. The Cape buffalo doesn't get hooked up. It doesn't get hurt by the birds being around. As far as it's concerned, the birds could come or go, but the birds definitely get a benefit by being around the Cape buffalo. That's commensalism. Finally, our last type of symbiosis is parasitism. Parasitism. This is where one species gets the hookup by hurting another one. Now, when you think parasite, you probably think like ticks and worms and stuff like that. But this is a pretty broad category. Let me give you an example. This is the cuckoo bird. And here it's being fed by another species of bird. Why is this bird feeding the cuckoo? That's because this bird up here, the warbler, thinks the cuckoo is its baby. How cuckoo birds reproduce is they never raise their own young. What happens is a cuckoo bird will come and lay its egg into the nest of another species of bird. And then what happens is that other species of bird feeds the cuckoo bird like it's its own child, and off they go. Now the benefit of this is that the cuckoo bird reproduces, but it doesn't have to spend any time, any energy raising its own kids. And so the cuckoo bird gets the hookup, the warbler gets screwed by it. That's an example of parasitism. One species benefits, the other one gets hurt. Other examples of parasitism, here's a nasty parasite. This is a parasite that attacks fish. See this guy here living inside the fish's mouth? This is actually a parasite. And what this parasite does is it swims inside the fish, it attaches to the fish's tongue, it eats the fish's tongue, and then this parasite actually becomes the tongue of the fish. And no, I'm not making this shit up. This actually happens. Now, how this is an example of parasitism is that anytime this fish eats, this parasite right here gets first dibs of the food that's coming by. And so he'll eat the food that the fish is eating. And so this guy gets hooked up. This fish here definitely gets screwed. That's an example of parasites. Other example of parasites, you got things like the botfly, and you got worms and so forth that can live inside of you. These are obviously examples of one species benefiting and the other species being hurt. So those are the three different types of symbiosis. You've got mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism.